Well, good morning, and thank you very much for coming along to this Political Studies Review Roundtable.
Okay, because we can't see you.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, I'm Jane Tinkler from the London School of Economics. I've been working for the last 3 years with colleagues Patrick Dunleavy and Simon Bastow on the LSE's Impact of Social Sciences project, which I think is a reason why I'm chairing this, along with the fact that I was the first managing editor of Political Studies Review, so this seems very fitting. So this session is on the social relevance and impact of political science. We're in REF year, so I think relevance and impact are high probably on most of our list of priorities. And although the REF process has made us think about our individual and maybe group of colleagues' relevance, it's also forced us to think about the impact of our discipline. This is especially the case when, in times of financial pressures, it feels that the discipline is under attack. Maybe we can look to the US, where last week an amendment was passed to restrict all the National Science Foundation research grants in political science, except those that promote the national interest or the economic interest of the US. So there are a lot of really interesting questions to ask on this subject, and we're going to hear today from 4 of our panellists, and hopefully with lots of questions and contributions from you all. So we're going to start with hearing from about 5 minutes or so from each of our panellists, and then we're going to open the session up to questions. So we're going to start by hearing from Dr. Rosie Campbell, who's Senior Lecturer in Politics at Birkbeck, University of London.
Thank you very much. Well, it's really nice to be here. I don't think I can see either Professor Matthew Flinders or Professor Peter John in the audience, which is particularly naughty as they started this off. I'm sure many of you read the contributions, or the kind of little, slightly staged fight between Peter and Matt in the LSE blog, arguing about impact and whether, to what extent. I think that their debates seem to fall down on, was there once a golden age of political impact where Bernard Crick was able to have a really high media presence and be considered a public intellectual and would be a go-to person on politics. Matt Flinders would argue that we've had a decline since then of interest in political scientists. And Peter John argued, actually no, perhaps this is the golden age now. Actually policymakers seek out evidence, they want evidence from us. Sarah Childs, who wrote this piece with me, and I think this debate's a bit of a false one really, and it's quite good fun, but actually it's slightly ritualistic because both of them actually agree on the crucial issue, and that is that we do actually need to try to be relevant. What is the point of writing all this stuff if only 1 or 2 other experts in your field actually ever read it? The idea that we should actually try and reach a wider audience seems to be something that they both agree on. And we can agree that there are risks that have to be anticipated and prepared for, but actually that the potential payoffs are so massive in terms of the impact that we can have on public debate and the quality of public debate and on policy making, that there is no way that we should decide to hide in the ivory tower and not engage in this kind of debate. So in our paper, Sarah and I...
Peter John has just now.
Peter John's here!
Still have dodgy Matt Flinders.
Yeah, well, no, we'll wait for him to arrive and we can cheer again.
Oh, we should be right.
Now. So in our paper, we set out why we think that this is a no-brainer, that we should all be doing it. Then we discuss some of the ways we might kind of manage the risks involved, and then we also talk about what we call the feminist imperative. And we say that actually feminist academics have always tried to do engagement, dissemination and impact. And maybe there's something the mainstream of political science can learn from their experience, although I'm well aware that there are associated problems that we discuss in the paper. So Matt Flinders describes political science as a discipline in desperate search for its soul. We can say safely that gender and politics suffers from no such longing. It's a passion-infused subdiscipline. And it's that passion for change and transformation which has always driven feminist academics out into the real world, out to try and engage with other feminists, be they policymakers, be they journalists, be they members of women's groups, to actually try and work together. And they've always involved participants in their research from an early stage and being quite active, wearing but one of the problems that comes from this is wearing two hats. You know, and there are other kinds of activists in political science. I know there are one or two lefties left alive, perhaps even in the room, who are actively involved in politics still. So we're not saying this is exclusively something that feminist academics have done, but certainly feminist academics have had this history of engagement. But it does come with a problem because you end up having two hats. The one, the passionate feminist who wants to see transformative change, and the other, the social researcher who has to endeavour to be objective, or as objective as possible. And how do you deal with these conflicting demands? You know, feminists have always been criticised for failing to kind of don the invisibility cloak of the objective researcher. I actually think this is for the good, because it's clear what your normative agenda is. It's not hidden in the text anywhere. But we still have to know about making a distinction between the evidence and our opinion. And this is something, as a feminist academic, you have to think about quite clearly, because it's so obvious. So if you go on Women's Hour and they say, should there be more women politicians, I'm always very careful to say, well, I think so, yes, but the evidence, blah, 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 and making a distinction between the body of evidence and me. And I think that's something we can be afraid to bring us into public debate, but I think if we make the distinction, that's really important. And actually, one of the reasons we're ever called on to news programmes or asked to engage in public debate is because academics have been trusted. And why are we trusted? We're not any brighter than those journalists out there. In fact, on a lot of things we know perhaps less. We know a lot about, a deep knowledge about a very narrow subject area, and they want us because we are trusted. And one of the reasons we're trusted is because of the time involved in the production of our research. We have a little bit of critical distance from our work. You know, by the time something's got published, it's been through peer review, an obvious part of the process, but it's also gone through many iterations, and you've had time to find, oh God, I've put the wrong figure in here, or, you know, the errors that are in there, and you've had time to clean it up. And the thing about engaging in public debate is it's so fast. And how do we deal with that problem of wanting to participate, wanting to be involved, but actually not having this critical distance from the work? And what we say that you've got to do is you've got to build an engagement strategy in with your research right from the beginning, right from when you start the project, so that you're constantly writing up your work in a way that can be communicated and expressed to a wider audience. And this is only a good thing. It helps to clarify what we're thinking, clarify what we're doing. Matt's here! No, yes, he is! Sorry, we did do that for Peter as well. So that kind of process of integrating it is something we also think is really important from a feminist perspective. We don't want to be accused of chronic Winchester syndrome and saying, oh no, it's just another burden that we must bear as political scientists. We don't think that. One of the great things about trying to do engagement and dissemination is that you can do it in the night after the kids have gone to bed. You can be on Twitter, you can be on your email. It can be really flexible. You can fit it around your own day. Obviously, if you get a call from the Today programme, you've got to get up and you've got to go, and there's less flexibility. But some of these things can be managed in your own time. But it's got to be incorporated in work models, and it's got to be incorporated in promotion procedures. Otherwise, it's going to be a disadvantage to people who've got commitments outside of their professional lives. That's something we argue for quite strongly. Sorry, new iPad, can't seem to change the page. Okay. So we also, right at the end of our paper, we lay out what we think are the prescriptions for doing impact, engagement and dissemination well. And some of these are borrowed from the experts. Matt Flinder's triple writing we think should become a norm across the discipline. We also think that the excellent political science blogs that are now available are a really good source, and that we should really be encouraging each other and encouraging junior colleagues to think about writing blogs as early as possible, so that when they get a new piece of research, they're actually thinking about how they can communicate it more widely. We also think that We need to work together. There's so much backbiting across the kind of disciplinary silos, across the methodological divide, which is not productive in terms of getting our stories across. And I think we can learn from some areas of science where they have voices in the public realm that aren't necessarily the authors of the original research, but are able to convey it in a way that's accessible. And we need to work together to think, okay, well, you're the theorist, I'm the person doing the quants. What can we say on this topic? Can we write a blog together? Can we actually start to cooperate? And we think that this is part of the feminist lesson. Homo economicus has no place in this kind of endeavour. It's not just about an individualistic pursuit of your own career goals and being, you know, a public talking head or, you know, willing to talk on any issue. It's about using your expertise wisely and in cooperation with others to actually really make a difference to the quality of public debate, and to be thinking about where you can make those connections and make those combined efforts more often. So there are risks that we have to balance. Misrepresentation. Always make sure you've got a really clear story line that you can sell or that you were able to explain. Otherwise, misrepresentation is much more likely. And that you don't get overstretched. I was on a BBC Expert Women Training Day last week, and the constant refrain from journalists was that they would call women up and say, will you speak about your research? And they would say yes. And then they would say, will you speak about something just outside of your research? And the women, more often than men, would say no. And that was a point of criticism about the women that I think there is some truth in. But there was another area that I think is also problematic. Saying yes to talk about golf, you know, if you actually are a political scientist. You know, we all have our core area of research, and then we have a periphery where our knowledge is deeper than perhaps the average member of the public. And then there's a whole other area where really we're not an expert at all. And I think it's important to develop the balance of what you have to offer and what your selling point is and what you should just say yes to and what you should say no to. But all of those risks aside, I think it's a no-brainer. I agree with both Flinders and John. We should all get out more.
Thank you. Our second panellist is Rod Rhodes, who's Professor of Government at the University of Southampton.
Thank you. I have been working in Australia for the past 10 years. I'm Yorkshire born and bred, and coming back home, it was a little bit like a Martian visiting Earth, because whilst I'd been away, impact analysis had arrived and open access had arrived. And as a result of this invitation, I had the singular privilege of reading the LSE's impact manual, which was extremely informative and made me even more scared. And then I read the Academy of Social Sciences brief on open access, and I thought perhaps returning to Mars would be a really good idea at this point in time. And then Jane arrived with 10 articles on impact, led off by Matt and Peter. And having read 10 articles on this, being then asked to sort of come up with, say something original or new, was really hard. I mean, Matt actually quotes the phrase that we need to engage with multiple publics in multiple ways. I mean, I found it really hard to actually disagree with that, and I also found it really hard to add anything substantive to that. But when I got to the end of the 10 articles, I had sort of a nagging doubt in my head, and sort of worries kept raising their thing. First of all, there was the obvious sort of caveats you have whenever you read anybody's work. I mean, Peter John cites Carol Weiss on the importance of a climate of ideas and the gradual assimilation of those ideas in the public sector. And I think Carol's insights are extremely good, but I particularly like the phrase that she uses of knowledge creep. And the point about knowledge creep, the very phrase implies that it's a slow process, that nothing is going to happen very, very quickly. And I thought running through all of the papers was implicitly that we were actually promising too much. That we might write our papers and we might have good ideas and we might practice the art of translation and get them into different media and sell them. But actually, the way our ideas got into the policy process, you could be talking about 5 or 10 years. And I was quite impressed when I was a PhD student, and one is always impressed with the supervisor, I hope. And Jim Sharp at the time actually said to me, and he was centrally involved in doing policy analysis, he was the advisor to the Royal Commission on Local Government, for example, that actually social scientists are best being a cobbler and sticking at your last and making the best quality shoe, and if the shoe's any good, people will come and buy it off you. And I have to say, 30 odd years later, I'm still persuaded that that is an argument with considerable power in it. Now, it's not an argument against the art of translation, but it is a caution against promising that what we can deliver, especially promising to be able to deliver on, e.g., a 5-year ref cycle, which is actually what we seem to be going to be held to. So that's point one. Point two was, who owns this policy? And implicit, again, running through all the papers, was the notion that at least to some degree, the political science profession owns this policy. And again, I'm the new boy back, so I mean, I'm not au fait with all of the details of this, but I found it a bit hard, given my previous experience with all of these assessment exercises over here. Because one of the things which is quite distressing about them is they end up being owned not only by the government, with which to control the total amount of resources it pumps into the university sector and the distribution of those resources, it ends up being owned by university management. Now, a little story, just to illustrate the point, from Australia. We had the equivalent of REF, it was called ERA. And as part of the first round of ERA, they produced a list of journals. And the journals were ranked. So there were A-star journals, e.g. APSR, A journals, e.g. political studies, B journals and C journals. And you were assessed as to whether or not you were publishing in the better quality journals. Now, as a shortcut, because there's an awful lot to read, I don't object to that as a shortcut. But university management then got its hands on it. And all of a sudden, when you came up for promotion, and you hadn't known about this for the previous 10 years of your career, people were suddenly asking, how many A-star journals have you got? How many A journals have you got? If you came up with a C journal, they wanted to know why you'd even included it. Why were you even thinking of publishing in a C journal? Nothing to do, therefore, with the quality of the work that you'd actually done, and the fact that your mate had just set up a new journal and you were helping him, her out. No notion of that at all. The quality of the article was judged by its actual ranking. And so all of a sudden, there was one poor postdoc, early career researcher at UTAS, is told by the head of department that when they come up for promotion in consolidation to lecturer A in 3 years' time, they've got to have 2 A-star articles on their CV. Now, I thought that was unreasonable. I mean, frankly, for the first 3 years, I would just like people to publish. I'd like them to get it in a C journal, provided they get it out there, and I would like them to learn their craft by publishing in a variety of journals for a variety of audiences. Saying you've got to publish in A-star journals, all of which were predominantly American journals, i.e. really hard for anybody to get in outside of the US, let alone your early career person. It seemed to me what was happening here was what on the face of it seemed a perfectly reasonable shortcut for managing a mound of information, had actually become a major obstacle for young people in universities who had to do something that no generation before them had ever been expected to do, and they had to do it at about a year's notice. I mean, it just seemed to me absolute nonsense. Could this happen with impact? I read one of the papers which said, of course, in America, we have our ranking of public intellectual journals. And listed 6 or 7 of the public intellectual journals. What prompted this thought? It suddenly occurred to me, wow, I can see the UK having a list of relevant journals. And I can see the relevant journals being ranked. And I can hear the dean coming on one of those missions that they have to bring the unenlightened to the truth and telling us, why, Rod Rhodes, haven't you published in some public intellectual journal? And the answer is, because I want to. I've actually got a big book to get out for e.g. Oxford, and I want to write my next book. Please go away. That's me. Can you imagine
except you wouldn't say the please bit.
But can you imagine the position of somebody who is in the early stages of their career, bearing no position to reject this argument? And then, of course, the side effect of that is these journals get completely swamped with material from everybody else, and it becomes even harder to get into them. So who owns this policy is actually, seems to be a very important problem. It doesn't seem to be one that any of the papers particularly address. And in particular, I think we need to not only look at the national government and its interests in this policy, but also at university management and their interests in this policy, which I suspect are not coterminous with our interests. That's what the final point before I sit down Just a little pet bugbear of mine. At several junctures, I suspect it's necessary to do this to genuflect to the ESRC or some other government department. There are references to how we've improved our quantitative techniques, how we've got these skills, etc., etc., etc. And Matt Flinders, bless him, actually talks about the art of translation. And at various junctures, other people mention that we have to write for different audiences. There's actually nothing in there about the craft of writing. That prompted the thought, I don't think I've ever worked at any university ever which attempted to give its PhD students any systematic course in the craft of writing. And now we've just changed the game. Now you not only have to learn how to write for an academic journal, you'll get plenty of practice at that, you've now got to learn to write for a whole variety of other journals as well, and for a whole variety of other outlets, each with their own demands, each with their own style requirements as to how you address the putative readership. Now, it seems to me that a course not on the art of translation, but on the craft of writing is something, if we're taking impact seriously, we ought to include as part of the toolkit for our PhD students. Because if it's that important, and everybody's going to be doing it from here on in, then at a very early stage, we need to be giving our people the skills to do this. And again, I don't know how many of you got experience of the kinds of novel writing courses, etc. I've never been on one, but I read a book about one once. And what clearly happens, which I've never come across in my universities, is you write something for a specific project, let's say it's a public intellectual journal, and then that article is read by the group of people with whom you are, and they criticise it, and you go away and you bring another piece of writing and they criticise it, and through this iterative process you actually get some really concrete feedback from people at your own stage of your career and from an expert as to how to improve your writing. So if we're serious about impact, we actually need to incorporate it into the teaching of our postgraduate students, and we need to give them courses on the craft of writing to help them write not just their PhD, which is what we focus on at the moment, but to write for the variety of outlets they're going to have to accommodate in the rest of their careers. And let's face it, even those who are not going to stay in academia would actually benefit from having a course in those kinds of writing skills. So those three reflections from outside about what still seems to me to be an odd process, which was abandoned in Australia on the ground there was no proven methodology for actually implementing it.
Our third panellist is Dr. Catherine de Rose, who's Senior Lecturer and Director of Research at the Institute of Local Government Studies at the University of Birmingham.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, everybody. Okay, so thinking about the machinery of impact, I was surprised when discussions first came up about the inclusion of impact criteria in the REC. And I'm not sure if other people here, or maybe people here, signed the petition that was circulated at the time that sort of said that academics should be free to pursue blue skies thinking and not be sort of inhibited by ideas of actually having to create impact. I think that some of the criticisms of the kind of machinery of impact, the way that it's going to be assessed, can certainly be criticised. I think some of it's actually counterproductive, an emphasis on individual accountability and the way it disincentivises interdisciplinary work and collaborative practice. But I think the call for impact is important because it at least presents the challenge to us that it's important to think about the linkages we can create between our research and affecting social change. And I think it's heightened the importance of having this sort of conversation within the discipline about what our role of researchers is, not only in terms of policy or practice, or indeed even in terms of public debate, but actually in the communities that we perhaps may be researching, but certainly the communities that our universities are situated within. My research background is in governance and participation, and much of the research in that area focuses on the limits of public institutions to be able to encourage or sustain participation and the lack of a kind of meaningful transfer of power to communities. Being sort of instilled in that kind of sub-discipline has made me sort of recognise that a lot of the research that makes those sort of criticisms is in and of itself not participatory. And it made me think that actually as researchers, maybe, certainly researchers in governance and participation, maybe we need to kind of begin to practice what we preach. I would argue that I think there is and agree with Peter John in his arguments that there is some excellent engaged work within political science, but I think as a discipline, we still seem to be kind of dominated and inhibited by ideas of researcher capture, and that somehow participation in research means that our knowledge is going to be biased with a potential loss of objectivity. I think we can actually learn a lot from looking at other disciplines beyond political science to engage with, respond to an engagement critique. If we look at disciplines such as critical and social geography, development studies, sociology and anthropology, where the participation of those people who are being researched has been actively kind of embraced, and it's explicitly driven by a value base, whether you think it's sort of John Gavence's work on the idea of democratic knowledge production, Paulo Freire works about the importance of a kind of counter-hegemonic force for creating knowledge. Such research aspires to actively alter social conditions and engage the researchers from the start of the process. So I would argue that we've talked about translation already, but it's not just about translation, it's about the mobilisation of research. And the idea of, as Rosie said, of academic kind of activism. So I would argue that the kind of parameters of the public engagement debate that we're currently having as a discipline doesn't actually seem to be kind of sufficiently broad. I don't think we can be complacent about the significant and fundamental challenge of closing the so-called relevance gap between our research and the wider society that we sit in, and what that means actually for thinking about our own research practice and also our frameworks of research governance and funding. So I just want to go and say two quick points before I finish. The first point is about kind of research governance. At the moment, most universities' ethics and governance of research is based on a kind of public harm model, a medicalised model, which is about minimising harm to participants. This model very much emphasises the potential risks. Anybody who's ever had to fill in an ethics form will know there are lots of things of like what potential risks and harms are there to people participating. But it shows very little interest in creating and sustaining relationships with those who are being researched or the communities that are affected by that research. And those institutional norms don't value that communities with the power to influence their own lives are actually to influence that research. In some recent work that I've done with a couple of people actually in this room, we sort of argued that we need to move research governance away from this paradigm of public harm, which restricts the community voice in research, and away to thinking, drawing on ideas of Mark Moore, ideas of public value, of actually saying that this might be a rediscovery of the civic purpose of universities, it might be about the new ideas that have been bandied around currently about the public university, but it's about an opportunity to remake the relationships between universities and the communities that they're situated in and that researchers are working with. The second point I want to make is also about research practice. Public engagement and impact, I don't think it can be mistaken for dissemination. So whilst I blog, and very occasionally, I don't really like it, tweet, I don't think that the challenge of impact is about doing research in the same way that we've always done it, but then writing a blog about it, or tweeting about it, or writing a short report about it. I think it actually makes a more fundamental challenge to the way that we actually do our research. I think in academia, we often, there's a sort of hierarchical ordering of the kind of work that we think has value. And at the top of that list is theoretical and often abstracted work, and at the bottom of that list is often applied kind of work. And I think that often commentators have seen that academic practice can actually be designed as a refuge from engagement. So peer review, whilst it can make us trusted, can also act as a form of kind of protectionism about who gets to define or legitimate knowledge, and reinforces a kind of cultural norm of valuing this audience, our international peers, rather than local or community concerns, or rather than the concerns of people who are necessarily being the subject of that research. I would argue that there are ways in which we can think about working with communities to effectively engage them in research and offering greater control over defining and creating what is publicly valuable research. But I think that presents a challenge to our own position or our own singular claims of sort of expertise. And really it's about, I think, to fundamentally challenge our own research practice is about recognising that whilst we have a particular kind of expertise, if we're interested in affecting social change, there are different types of expertise that we need to value equally. In recent works with colleagues, we've used the language of co-production, which was a slightly less weaselly word when I think we first started using it than it seems to have become since. And I'd argue that in thinking about co-production of research, there are sort of four key elements. One is how to create a more equal partnership between communities and practitioners and researchers, working in a dynamic relationship to understand issues, create knowledge and then implement findings. And this approach to research is underpinned by a respect of different bases for an expertise and claims for knowledge, and research production process that allows genuine participation at all stages and a transparency of the values that inform the inception of that work. I would also argue that this sort of participatory forms of research can actually produce better quality of research, certainly more effective research, and also give something back to the people who are the subjects of our work, offering greater control over the research process and opportunities to reflect and learn from that experience. What I've said so far might sound a little bit do-gooding, and I think that an ethos of being participatory is on its own insufficient, but it's also about a challenge to us as academics and researchers to think about complementary facilitative tools and methods that we can substantively engage with people. I've been involved in a number of projects on the AHRC's Connected Communities programme, which has forced us to work across discipline, and I'm increasingly interested in the use of arts-based practice and beyond text methods as a way of broadening the reach, reciprocity, and enhancing the connectivities of research. I would also argue that if we're meaningful about impact, and certainly an impact in the communities that we are situated in as a university or that we're researching, that it's not just about popping in and out of a community or looking for, when a pot of money becomes available, that we look for a community to work with. It's about demanding sustained relationships with communities. I think there's some excellent international practice that we can learn from. Spent quite a lot of time in Chicago over the last couple of years. I was really impressed by some of the public universities there and the work that they were doing to sustain relationships with the communities that they're situated in, and that research comes in and out of that situation, but the relationship with the university is mediated and sustained. I think meeting the challenge of impact demands not only fundamental reflection on our role as researchers and our practice and governance, but also researchers with enough confidence and commitment to generate new spaces and relationships for research. I think in the current climate and this context of austerity, whilst it might not always feel like it, we are possibly one of the few members of the community that still have some resources at our kind of disposal. And I think this makes it imperative to take this challenge on.